Close the door!
MPs are summoned for the first King's Speech in 70 years. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Cabinet Office Minister Alex Burkhardt, Shadow Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall, The Observer's Sonia Soda and Patrick Maguire of The Times. On today's programme. The first King's Speech in 70 years and almost certainly the last before a general election.
My ministers will introduce legislation to empower police forces and the criminal justice system to prevent new or complex crimes.
Talking tough on law and order, but does it match up to the government's record?
This bill will support the future licensing of new oil and gas fields.
More drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea. Will it cut bills for consumers? The King's Speech over, but without a promise to ban gay and trans conversion therapy having been delivered. We'll come to contents of the King's Speech in just a moment and the government's legislative programme for the year ahead. But first of all, let's have a look at this headline and story in The Sun. Not today, Mick Grinch, rather than Lynch. Christmas holiday saved as Rishi Sunak rams through new laws to ease strike disruption over festive period. Now, this is to do with minimum service legislation, which the government has already actually passed, but ministers have now set out what it will mean in practice. So, for example, during a rail strike, train companies across Britain would be expected to run 40% of their normal timetable. So, my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Alex, is this the Christmas present you've all been hoping for?
Well, I think the policy you just referred to is very important for, certainly people in my constituency to know that services aren't going to be disrupted over Christmas. We've had a lot of disruption from strikes over, the past year or so, and this is going to give people, certainty that they can celebrate Christmas and get their shopping done, everything like that. But more generally, on the King's Speech, I think this is a really, really, good show.
All right, well, we will come on and discuss all the contents. But just on this issue, it will include border force staff being expected to provide a service similar to the level on non-strike days and ambulance crews in England too. Is it what you've been hoping for?
I mean, I'd love a minimum service level on the train so I could get back to see my parents in Sussex, so that when I go to Leicester, I can actually get a seat and maybe possibly get on Wi-Fi. I'd love a minimum service for ambulances so that people aren't left waiting hours in pain and agony. There's no plan here to deal with those fundamental problems. And if the government wants to stop strikes, why has Mark Harper not met the union since Christmas last year?
Alex?
As you know, Liz, we're always open for discussions with unions.
Well, he hasn't had any.
Always open for discussions with unions. Where, as always is the case, in any negotiations, you have terms and conditions for coming to meet people. And quite frankly, some of the requests that unions have been making for pay have been unreasonable. So that's the answer to your question. But in terms of the policy that's been announced today, this is going to be good. It's going to mean that people know that they'll be able to travel to see relatives. It means that people know they'll be able to go on holiday. It means that people will be able to get the healthcare they need.
But Mark Harper has himself said that this legislation won't deal with the current round of disputes. If you want to do that,
no, but it's going to help people over Christmas. That's a good thing.
On both sides, and they've got to sit down together.
All right.
And I mean, there are many other things the government could do to make sure we can get us to see our families at Christmas, but they haven't put those reforms in place.
Well, with our other guests, is it the Christmas present you've been hoping for, or you think people are hoping for?
Well, I live on a commuter line, so I use the trains a lot. I use the train to go up to the northwest a lot to visit family. And I have to say that over the last year, there have been more times than not that trains have been disrupted. And actually, strikes have been a bit of an issue, but it's usually not strikes. It's just that the train companies in this country are providing a totally unreliable, shocking level of service. And in my view, it's the government's responsibility to set that out rather than positioning on strikes. I do have concerns about legislation that hands ministers sweeping powers to set minimum service standards in sort of broad areas like health and education without defining it, because I don't think it's right to erode the already fairly limited rights to strike that we have in this country.
Do you think people will welcome it?
Well, look, if like me and like seemingly everyone else on the panel, you want to get back to the provinces over Christmas, great. But, you know, listening to everybody here, I'm struck by this is a problem that's probably not going to be solved, i.e. the underlying problem, the disputes, the public sector pay disputes more broadly, are probably not going to be solved by this government. So it's really a question, a much bigger question, that Liz and her colleagues are going to have to address on the first day of a Labour government. And these problems aren't going to go away. The demands for pay aren't going to go away. Perhaps, you know, you've been criticising Alex for Mark Harper's approach to the unions. Perhaps you and other colleagues, Liz, will have a more constructive relationship with the trade union movement, but it's going to be a massive problem that people will expect to be solved by an incoming Labour government. And, you know, perhaps we need to hear more about the plan for that.
Well, Liz, will a Labour government, if they win a general election, repeal this minimum services legislation?
Well, we've already committed to repealing the existing lot of minimum service legislation that's been put in place. And we do want a constructive approach. I stand on the side of passengers because they need a decent service, and in order to get that we need big reforms of our railways, reforms that the government has promised over many years but hasn't delivered, and that I think is the focus that most people want to see.
Well, let's talk about what's at the heart actually of this King's speech, the government's programme for government. They put crime and justice at the heart of that speech today, and the government has said it will legislate to allow reasonable force at the discretion of judges to be used to make criminals appear in the dock to hear sentences. If offenders still refuse, they could face a further 2 years in prison. Do you welcome that proposal?
I've always wanted to see more rights for victims. But if, for example, you are a victim of rape, only 2% of rape cases ever end up being charged. Those that do go to court take 3 years. We are seeing more and more victims giving up on this whole process. So I want to see proper rights for victims and tougher sentences for criminals.
And you support the idea of bringing them to the dock?
Yes, but you've actually got to deal with the underlying problems in the criminal justice system. Not enough people being convicted, charged, huge backlogs in the courts, as well as tougher powers, I think, for the Victims Commissioner to take action.
Patrick, will people welcome this? Is it as easy as it seems to coerce offenders to come to the dock?
Well, look, it's clearly a very emotive issue, and it's no coincidence we're seeing this after people like Lucy Letby and the murderer of the young girl Olivia Pratt-Corbell, both of whom very emotive cases, refusing to come to the dock to face justice. So, look, this will be something that's very popular with people. But as you say, is it as simple as dragging someone up from the cells when someone is going to cause disruption? Clearly, there's a reason why, if it were that easy, the courts would be doing it already. But look, clearly, people want justice to be seen to be done as well as done. And so this will be a popular reform. But as Liz says, what's the bigger issue? Wow. It's court backlogs, etc., etc.
And we'll come on to that. But, Sonia, on that particular issue about dragging, maybe, offenders to the dock?
Well, I think it's interesting that the government are proposing to give judges the power to say when it's appropriate and not. And I think that's an important safeguard. But I think I understand why it's a big issue, but it's far, far from the biggest issue in the criminal justice system. And, I've been talking, to defence barristers. There's one London court, I saw a defence barrister tweeting today, that is now setting trial dates for October 2025. That's 2 years away. There was a 2017 offence, a sex offence that was reported to the police in 2017. There was a verdict in 2023. This is not a functioning criminal justice system. It doesn't deliver justice for victims. And it actually is very bad for public safety, because it means that people, sometimes dangerous people, are, in the community, because people actually know they're not going to get justice if they try and pursue it through the criminal justice system.
Well, Alex, what do you say to that?
Well, obviously, there have been delays in the court system, and that's why the government has a suite of interventions in place to try and bring that down. What we're seeing here is a very important step to make sure that people who are being sentenced can't hide away in the cells downstairs and have to come up and face justice.
Sure.
And yeah, as Patrick and Sonia pointed out, this will be at the discretion of the judge. If the judge thinks that somebody like, I don't know, Lee Rigby's killer was going to make a political statement or a show out of it, turn the court into a circus, they could say we're not going to use it in these circumstances.
All right.
But the police will be able to use reasonable force to get someone into the dock. I think that's fundamentally a good thing.
Well, that
obviously,
may be,
this is
Alex.
just one part of a number of announcements that are being made today, and there are very, very substantial
well, it may be welcomed.
Policies being proposed.
This specific proposal may be welcomed, but put it against the context of what the other guests have said, against a criminal justice system that's pretty well on its knees. It may be seen as an important move, but let's just show you this in The Guardian. England and Wales judges told not to jail criminals as prisons full. They reported that judges have been told to delay the sentencing of convicted criminals currently on bail, including rapists and burglars, because there just isn't enough room for any more of them. And then this in The Telegraph, 1 in 8 prisoners released early to ease overcrowding in jails. These are the issues that the public will ask, what have you been doing for 13 years?
That's why we are in the middle of the biggest prison building reform since Victorian times. Have 6 super prisons coming online, including excellent places like HMP Fossway, where you'll see not only state-of-the-art security, but also the latest facilities to help people get training and skills inside.
You admit it's too late. So that they can lead
meaningful lives when they come out of prison.
After 13 years, you've got prisoners being released early to ease overcrowding in jails, and you want more people to go to jail, increasing sentences. There's no room for them.
That's, as I say, Jo, that's why...
Too late.
That's why we are building 6 super prisons. 3 of them are open, 3 are coming online. We have an enormous amount of emergency provision, I think 100 extra cell spaces a day coming online. And the reason why, there is a squeeze at the moment in prisons, and the reason why is because we have taken steps to lock more people up for longer, which has meant that crime, not including fraud, has come down by 50% since Labour were in power. Those were the right steps to take. Absolutely right to take a firm step on law and order.
This is one example of many where, look, we need change. I think the public wants to see change, but the government can't be the change from their more than a decade of failure.
But they'll want to know that you can deliver on it too.
And that is if you look at our plan to make our streets safe again.
But what about building more prisons, for more prison spaces?
Well, we want to see those extra prison spaces.
So you will promise the funding for that?
Well, what we would do is spend the funding that's already... the government allocated £4 billion. They've spent only around a quarter of it. It's complete incompetence on their part. And let me go back to the fundamentals here. I think the government is reaping what they sow. They cut 20,000 police officers. We've lost our neighbourhood police, which was so essential for preventing crime and solving crime, building those relationships with communities. We've got a plan to bring back neighbourhood policing, prevent crime, as well as put in place the measures we need to deal with those huge problems we're seeing in growing knife crime, domestic violence against women, a proper plan, rather than this tinkering at the edges that we've seen, not just in this area, but many of the areas covered in the...
Well, Alice, what's happened to that money? Why is it not being spent?
Well, look, just on a couple of Liz's points. Labour always seems to suffer this sort of mass political amnesia. Yeah, there were cuts in 2010. Let's remind everyone why. It's because you guys made such a dog's breakfast of the economy. That's why, and that's what that. So of course there had to be public sector cuts. And since then, we have been bringing more police online. We've locked up more criminals. We've locked them up for longer. And now we're building more prison places than anyone has done since Victorian times.
Why are you releasing criminals?
That is what we're taking. The question for you, Liz, is are your party going to support us? And I don't think you've committed to that. Are you going to do that? Will you continue, if you got into power, would you commit to sustaining that funding?
Alex, we will put in place our reforms to be tough on offences.
What does that mean?
Specialist rape courts, specialist units in the police, bringing back neighbourhood policing, focusing on rehabilitation in prisons, making sure we've got the prison places. The Conservatives have not got a plan to tackle the root causes of crime here and have an effective system, releasing prisoners early, delaying sentences of convicted criminals, rape cases plummeting. It is an appalling situation. We need a new approach, a time for change, and this government
And these are
can't
competing
deliver.
visions. It's interesting that crime and justice is at the heart of this King's Speech, because it's not an easy programme for the government to promote a year out from a general election. But it will be about delivery on the Labour side too, won't it?
Absolutely. But I think the other thing that gets a bit lost in this is our prisons are very dangerous places at the moment because of understaffing. And that's because cuts over the last year have seen, you know, very experienced officers leave. And that's why you end up with violent, dangerous men escaping a prison like Wandsworth Prison.
Right. Well, let's come to that, because we've talked about prison places, but prisoners who are released are put on licence in many cases in the community. But the Probation Service is struggling, Alex. Zara Alina's killer, who had his sentence cut from 38 to 33 years, was released from prison just 9 days before murdering Zara. He'd been wrongly assessed as medium risk by probation staff and had 28 previous convictions for 69 separate offences. The Chief Inspector of Probation told the BBC earlier this year that there was a chronic shortage of probation officers across England, and particularly in London, where 50% of posts were found not to have filled in some boroughs. Is that case emblematic of the criminal justice system, and particularly the Probation Service?
We have been increasing the number of probation officers every year for the past few years. We absolutely appreciate this need, and we're rising up to meet that need. And, you know, there's absolutely terrible cases, sort of things we really don't want to see. You do, and it's why we need to recruit more probation officers, as we are doing. But it's only one part of the picture. The other part of the picture is making sure that we have a functioning court system and that we have capacity in our prisons, and that's exactly what the government's setting out to do.
Well, on the recruitment and retention of probation officers, Liz, is there a plan for Labour to prevent something happening again that happened to Zara Alina? Would you increase pay to tackle the shortage of probation officers?
If I look at what's happened to the Probation Service since I became an MP in 2010, the government brought in this sort of privatisation, big contracts, and I remember going to visit one of the new service providers in my constituency, and them saying to me, oh, we're discovering a lot of people have mental health problems. And so I said, are you working with the local with the local hospital, with local voluntary groups dealing with mental health problems? And I kid you not, they said to me, could you give us their contact details? And I thought, what? You need actually a probation service that understands the local communities, that works in partnership
and are paid
with
properly.
others.
Probation officers who are paid properly for a very difficult job.
Of course we need to see
And
our
would you do
staff
that? Would you increase
properly paid. We will only make spending commitments that we know that we can keep. But we do have a plan to sort out the criminal justice system. I think a lot of people in our prison service, because we haven't got enough places, on the front line because they're struggling with all of the problems in their local areas. It puts pressure on staff. I wish there was a single silver bullet that would solve it all.
But there are some specific... Yeah, but we're trying to sort of
future.
nail down a few specific proposals that could make a difference, because one of Labour's key missions, 5 missions, is to take back our streets, and you've outlined some of the things that you would undertake. You say you want to halve serious violent crime and halve the level of violence against women and girls. I suppose for someone might ask, why only halve it?
I think that's ambitious. I would like to go further, but having clear targets about the outcomes we want, proposals for how they'll be met. For me, the biggest single change would be bringing back that local neighbourhood policing that makes such a difference in preventing crime and solving it. And we've heard nothing from the government about that today.
I mean, has there just been a lack of political focus on the criminal justice system when it feels like a Cinderella department in general when it comes to justice, and even parts of the Home Office? Secretaries of State changing every few months, or certainly every few years, and that's the reason we're here in this situation.
Well, just look at the number of Justice Secretaries there have been over
11?
the past decade. You're absolutely right. The other question we have to consider is both parties are saying broadly the same thing rhetorically about crime, which is we want to be tough on crime. But you write that cheque and you have to cash it. For instance, look at some of the measures in the King's Speech today talking about tougher prison sentences for people guilty of certain crimes. Where are the prison places? That's a question we have to ask. Are you going to build more prison places? Or Conservative MPs, indeed Labour MPs, going to object to plans to build prisons in their own constituencies, as keeps happening? You know, and also your line of questioning to Liz, I think, is absolutely the right one. If the Labour Party is proposing to reform the justice system, it's all very well and good talking about reform, but, you know, that's going to have to be paid for at some point. And I know that's the Labour line, isn't it? You can't make spending commitments you can't keep. But ultimately...
It's not just a line, it's a belief, actually.
No, of course it's a belief, but...
Because you don't think you should promise things you can't deliver.
Yeah, you know, your promises are bold. You know, it's not that you are not promising anything.
Reform is one of the ways that you do that.
But it also requires investment as well.
Of course it does, investment alongside reform. But I think it is those big changes in the criminal justice system that we need to see on prevention, on neighbourhood policing, and a proper programme on particular areas like knife crime and violence against women, where we know specific interventions work that we haven't seen from the government.
I mean, people will judge you on your record, won't they, Alex? It could be just a year until the next general election. There won't be time for many of these things that you're proposing to fully bed down. People will judge you on the last 13 years and they'll be found wanting.
I don't think they will, because crime, as I say, crime excluding fraud, is down 50% since 2010.
Although fraud is one of the biggest crimes that people actually experience.
Look, people in my constituency are most concerned about burglary, about violent crime, and those are the things that we succeed in taking action on. And what we're announcing today, what Alex Chalk and the Prime Minister have announced today, will take that to the next stage.
Can I just ask you about this? Because this weekend, the Mail on Sunday reported that former Conservative Party chairman, Sir Jake Berry, wrote to the police about a Conservative MP who had multiple rape allegations made against them. And he raised concerns that the politician was allowed to continue to offend after the Tory party allegedly paid for one of the alleged victims to receive support but did not investigate it. Now, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has described the allegations as very serious and has said that there could already be a live police investigation, and Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden has denied a cover-up. But when you take this discussion that we've just been having, tackling serious sexual crime and violence as part of today's King's speech, how can women feel safe from violence within the Conservative Party with this?
Look, this is a dreadful story, and I'm afraid I don't know the details of it, but I just strongly encourage anyone who knows anything to go to the police. And
sure, but how do you think it looks, the Tory party, when you're talking about trying to tackle serious sexual violence against women?
As I say, it's a dreadful story, and but what I would say is that over the past, as the Lord Chancellor has been on the radio talking about this morning, over the past few years we have seen a number of additional support services for people who are in this situation, 24/7 helpline for people who've been raped, and additional support for victims. And that is, I know that there's a lot further to go, but that's very important work.
All right, well, let's talk about something that wasn't in the bill. It's called conversion therapy. We'll have a listen to Penny Mordaunt, who was the Equalities Minister in July 2018, when she said this.
The LGBT Action Plan consists of 75 actions that the government will take in order to address the survey's findings. The extension of our existing anti-homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying programme, and the commitment to end the practice of conversion therapy in the UK.
Well, that was Penny Mordaunt in 2018. Alex, what's happened to that promise to ban conversion therapy?
So the government is still committed to addressing this, sort of very, very difficult issue. There are obviously a lot of people in the country who share our concern about it. Sure. That people, we don't think that people who are gay or lesbian should have to live in a society where there are people effectively campaigning.
But have you dropped the promise to ban it?
So this is, as you will appreciate, Jo, this is quite a legally difficult and sensitive area.
But it wasn't in the King's speech.
We're still looking into it. I'm sure you're all paying very close attention to when His Majesty was talking. One of the last things he said was, other measures will be laid before you. Right? So just because something isn't in the King's speech, it doesn't mean that it's been rule out.
Right. So it hasn't been, but it hasn't been dropped. So you're saying that it hasn't been dropped. You're still committed to it.
It's very, very important to get this right. What we don't want to do, and just if I can just set this out in a couple of seconds, what we don't want to do is end up in a situation where you get legislation that accidentally criminalises parents or teachers, and yes, we want to do something. We just don't want to end up in a bad legal space.
All right. Well, that's obviously news to us because it wasn't there. But you're right. It does say at the end of the King's speech, other matters may be laid before the House of Commons. Let's talk to Jane Ozanne, a former LGBT government advisor. Jane, what do you make of that? It wasn't in the King's speech. You might have heard what Alex Burkhart has just said, that they're still working on it. It hasn't been dropped.
I don't believe him for a second. I'm sorry, Jo. We've been hearing promises since 2018. We've been told that the government's working it at pace. We've been told there's all sorts of complexities that many other international communities have dealt with, moved quickly, known that this is a key issue, and gone and banned. And I'm afraid the government is prioritising perpetrators, listening to perpetrators. They've been hoodwinked by a lot of evangelical right-wing MPs who've written to them saying, oh, you've got to be very careful here. The international human rights legal community have been advising the government for years now about how to go about banning this. And the government has not wanted to listen. It hasn't listened to survivors like myself. And it's time, we need the protections to stop this practice.
Alex?
Anyone who tells you this is easy hasn't looked at the legal situation. I'm sorry. I cannot, and I can't. Have you say
Canada,
that I can't have you say that we're listening to some
Germany,
evangelical people in the party.
Argentina.
The fact is that the government is looking at this and taking it seriously, and it wants to do it properly. It wants to do it properly.
Right.
No, I'm so sorry. That it's utter rubbish. You've been looking at it for years. There's plenty of other international countries who you could learn from, and indeed you could sit down and listen to those of us who've been working in this space for years. But none of that.
That's exactly what ministers are doing.
Well, hang on then. So, Sonia, well, hang on, Jane. Let me bring in the other guests as well to talk to you. Sonia, how do you feel about this? Is the government right to pause if that's what they're doing?
I think it is right to pause on what it calls trans conversion therapy. So I think there's an issue with conflating gay conversion therapy, which is an abhorrent practice. I think every right-minded person would think that it should be banned, and therapy for children with gender dysphoria. So that's children who may be female but think they're a boy, and vice versa. And what lots of experts have expressed concerns about is that an ill-defined conversion therapy ban on what's called trans conversion therapy would end up ensnaring exploratory talking therapy for children with gender dysphoria. And that would be very worrying because in this country, we're moving away from what's called the affirmative model of treatment for children with gender dysphoria, which is to say, if a child says, I think I'm a boy, if I'm female, and vice versa, well, you're trans, and treatment will take place from that point onwards, towards an exploratory model which acknowledges the fact that with gender dysphoria is a condition that resolves itself in many young people, and that it is associated with other conditions like autism, like with children grappling with same-sex attraction, with trauma, including child sexual trauma. And so, you need therapists to criminalise the relationship potentially between a therapist and a child will actually have a chilling impact, and it may mean that children can't access the therapy that they need. Now, that is a very complex, sensitive issue.
Well, it is.
I agree with Alex on it.
But Jane, you've been working, as you say, on this particular part of conversion therapy too. What's your response?
Well, again, there's a lot of muddying of the water. Conversion therapy or conversion practices are defined as anything with a predetermined purpose. That phrase is key. Predetermined purpose by the perpetrator who believes that it's impossible for the person in front of them to be trans or gay. And so they go through all sorts of, it could be prayer, it could be supposed therapy. But the starting point is to say that this is an impossible outcome and you must therefore change. That is miles away from the good and correct therapy that many children and adults need to help them come to a point of peace about who they are. They need to be challenged. They need to be in a safe space. And that is what affirmative care is about. It's not about saying yes. It's about creating a safe space where people can be affirmed, but also then challenged. And that is what we've been proposing all along.
But in Canada, so one of the countries that Jane mentioned, the law there is considered to be ill-defined. So, for example, there is a trans mental health nurse who's on the record saying that they now won't treat children with gender dysphoria because the law is ill-defined, it can't be specific enough, and they worry that if they do take an exploratory approach with a child with gender dysphoria, that they might risk being criminalised if a child were to say, I was in a therapy session and my gender identity was questioned, when it's actually the process of exploratory talking therapy.
But Jane, can the law be defined more specifically and more carefully?
Absolutely, and we've been learning from what has happened around the world, and that's why we brought together the Ban Conversion Therapy Legal Forum, chaired by Baroness Helena Kennedy KC, to put together, the wise thinking about how we should approach this. This has got major international human rights lawyers from the UN. Helena herself has given time to look at this. And I'm afraid those who say, oh, it's complex, we need to take more time. We've been working on this for years.
But the EHRC has said it's complex and there needs to be more time. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission, they're filled with expert lawyers as well.
Well, let me ask Liz, would a Labour government ban conversion therapy?
It's so-called therapy, yes. We want that to happen. And can we just...
And you do it?
And we would do it. Now, of course, you don't want to include... proper therapy within this. I think there is a way that we can do that, and let's just focus on what this actually means to some people. In the past, we have seen people being made to go through exorcisms, drugs, all sorts of things, which is really, it isn't just unethical, it's deeply harmful. So the government should move. They should make sure proper therapy is excluded from this. We believe there's a way of doing it. The government should get on it.
And how would you deal with some of the concerns raised by Sonia when it comes to dealing with gender dysphoria?
Well, my understanding is that there is a way of making sure within a clearly defined law that the normal practice of proper therapy is not included within this. This is about forced conversion, and we want to see that ended.
Right. I mean, there are MPs, colleagues of yours, Alex, in the Conservative Party, who are very unhappy that the ban is not in this King's Speech. Do you want to see a conversion therapy ban, personally?
I don't want to see conversion therapy, as Liz says, so-called conversion therapy, continue at all. But equally, this is major legislation. It would require major legislation. I think Sonia has set out very articulately some of the difficulties that exist in that, and I know that some people will claim that they have all of the answers and it's all very straightforward and simple. If that were the case, then it would have been possible to move on this sooner.
All right.
It's much more important. I know people want to get this done quickly, but it's much more important to get it right.
All right. Jane, do you trust the Conservative Party to actually ban conversion therapy when they get the opportunity again?
Not an inch. We've had it in 2 Queen's speeches. We've been told for years they're working at pace. We've never had a meeting with the Prime Minister. We've had only 1 meeting with the Minister for Women and Equalities with survivors. They've not sat down and listened first-hand experience or to the lawyers who actually know how to approach this.
All right.
And I fear that there are internal divisions which the Prime Minister decided to put to one stage at one point. I am clear that Labour will do this properly, and I think it's about time they were allowed to do that.
All right, Jane Ozanne, thank you very much for joining us. Let me read you a little bit of the speech, King's Speech. It said, this bill will support the future licensing of new oil and gas fields, helping the country to transition to net zero by 2050 without adding undue burdens on households. For this discussion, we can speak to the SNP Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn. Hello to you, Stephen. If you don't mind, I'm just going to hold you there for a moment while I ask Alex. The reference to avoiding undue burdens on households, what does that mean?
Undue burdens on households? What in terms of oil and gas licences?
Yes.
Well, if we don't have an energy security in the long term, that's obviously a very dangerous thing for the British public. So,
right. Is it going to bring bills down? Is it going to bring people's heating bills
primarily
down?
This is about energy security. Okay?
Right.
That if you and it's also about job security for a lot of people as well. About job security and people in certainly some people in Scotland, but around the country, well over 100,000 jobs depend on on gas, and I think what I'm very pleased to see is that we're taking a pragmatic approach to getting to net zero in 2050. I'm very eager that when we get to 2050, the independent Committee on Climate Change said that we're still going to need some oil and gas for various purposes. I would much rather that was coming from domestic supply than coming...
Except most of it's going to be exported, isn't it? I'm not sure it's going to be used for domestic
When we
supply.
get to 2050, we are going to need... or we're going to continue to need oil and gas. I would much rather as much of that as possible came from domestic supplies, so we had domestic jobs, so we had revenue from taxes, whilst reaching our net zero target.
Yes, but when it says reaching it without adding undue burdens on households, what I'm going to get, it sounds like undue financial burden on households. But as you have admitted, and in fact, so has the Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, it's not really going to bring anyone's bills down, is it?
Well, if you have energy security, that offers you a degree of protection against future shocks.
All right, well, let's talk to Stephen Flynn. Stephen, on that basis, of course, the oil and gas industry supports about 196,000 jobs in Scotland. So the continuation and expansion of new oil and gas licences must be music to your ears.
Well, of course, many of those jobs are in Aberdeen. They're my neighbours and family members, indeed. I think what we need to reflect upon, though, when we're talking about oil and gas is that it's just 7 days since the government granted 27 licences. It's almost like they're fixing a problem which wasn't there. But what they are doing is simultaneously promoting oil and gas whilst pulling back on their investment in net zero.
But hang on. What about you? Are you in favour? No, but hang on. I'll speak to Alex again. Are you in favour of those new oil and gas licences that you've just outlined? Yes or no?
So in terms of the process that the government's putting in place with an annual review, what I would like that review to do is take an evidence-based approach to oil and gas extraction. Now, that evidence-based approach needs to look at energy security, it needs to look at net zero, it needs to look at jobs and opportunities, and it also needs to look at renewables investment.
But that's the process. That's the process. Are you in favour of new oil and gas exploration? Yes or no?
If those commitments can be met, then of course everyone would be. But if they can't be, then no, they shouldn't go ahead. But what we need to look at is the wider picture here when we're talking about energy security and jobs for the future, and that is the net zero future that we all want to see. We know the United States is investing heavily in renewable technologies through the Inflation Reduction Act. The danger is we're going to get left behind. And it's just 2 months, may I remind listeners, it's just 2 months since the UK government's offshore wind auction didn't attract a single bidder. What confidence can we have that they'll be able to achieve their aims in relation to oil and gas?
All right, well, I'll return to this in just a moment. But Liz, of course, Labour have said and have shouted about the fact you're going to have this massive investment programme, borrowing £28 billion in green climate change policies, although not in the first year. Why haven't Labour said no to oil and gas exploration and new licences until you win the election, if you do?
Well, you're right to say that we put forward quite a big and bold plan for clean, green energy.
While saying yes to new oil and gas licences.
Well, what we've said is we wouldn't revoke licences that have already been given. But I think this bill is a stunt. It won't deal with the main issue. What is the main thing everybody's worried about right now is they are terrified to put the heating on as we come up to winter because of the cost of energy. There's nothing in this that will bring those bills down. What we want to see is a really big change, doubling onshore, trebling solar and quadrupling offshore.
But not in the first year of a Labour government.
But building up to that. Why? Well. Why? Because it's cheaper energy, it provides that energy security, and crucially, it's also about jobs and growing the economy of the future. It is true that what we're seeing in the United States is a big programme of investment, putting investment in, getting that matched by the private sector, creating jobs, energy security and lower bills. That is surely the right way forward for the future.
What's the politics of all of this, Patrick?
Well, Liz is right. This is clearly a bit of a stunt by the government. It's an attempt to draw a dividing line with the Labour Party. But in answer to your question, the politics of this, particularly for parties of the progressive left, are incredibly difficult. Look at what's happening in the Middle East. Look at what's happened in Russia. The questions about energy security, where we get our power from, the green transition, aren't getting any easier, and that applies for the critical minerals you use to make car batteries and renewables as much as it does oil. So these questions are going to get even trickier. So there is a regional conflict in the Middle East. The question of where we get our oil and gas from is going to be even trickier. It's going to require governments of whatever colour to have incredibly difficult conversations with, let's be honest, some quite nasty people. Just over a year ago, Keir Starmer said he wasn't going to go to the World Cup in Qatar because of human rights concerns. Where did Mark Drakeford, the Welsh First Minister, go? Qatar, because he literally cannot afford to alienate the Qataris. All of their natural gas flows into Milford Haven. David Lammy was in Qatar last week. That's a recognition that you have to have these conversations. So look, the politics of this are just going to get trickier, particularly for governments, Labour governments in particular, that are balancing lots of promises, be that on green energy, on ethical foreign policy and the economy and the cost of living.
Liz?
The real world is difficult and complex. You have to deal with it as it is, not as you wish it should be. But the main thing that you have to do, at least, is have a plan that not only focuses on taking the action we need to tackle climate change, but I think actually we're getting this the wrong way round. The reason why we still have higher bills and we don't have energy security and we're not growing our economy is precisely because the government has failed to put in place those long-term changes that we really need. Yes, the world is difficult and frightening and challenging, but you don't deal with that by sticking your head in the sand. You deal with it by being honest and having that long-term plan, and that's what Labour is offering.
What's happened, Alex, to the promise to end the war on the motorist? Because there was nothing in this Queen's speech to tackle that.
Just before I go on to that, we have a long-term plan. The government has a long-term plan. We published that long-term plan today. We're going to increase energy security, and we're going to make sure that we protect British jobs. I mean, and also, this idea that there hasn't been action on the green agenda. This is probably the greenest British government in history.
Offshore wind auction, though, where not a single contract got awarded because the government had done the pricing all wrong. And industry experts have been warning your government.
I know you know a lot about this.
Letting green energy and security.
That's quite a good thing. I know a lot about
let him answer. Let him answer.
Oh, indeed, it is this. You might nothing. You might want to listen to Sonia. And
I do.
She's got. But Sonia will know that we now have the largest wind farm offshore wind farm in the world, the second largest offshore wind farm in the world, the third largest offshore wind farm in the world. We have seen greenhouse gas emissions in the UK come down faster than any other G7 country because of actions that this government
I want you to answer my question about
the 2050 net zero commitment is one that was brought in by this government.
Can I just say, Alex,
this pretense that the government has done nothing. We've actually had the most ambitious climate change
speech. Listen, the Committee on Climate Change does recognise that, but says the recent package of climate policy reforms increased the long-term risks and made net zero considerably harder to achieve. Now, my question is, what's happened to the promise to end the war on the motorist?
Look, you heard the Prime Minister earlier in the year take steps to protect motorists. We have an autumn statement coming up in a couple of weeks' time. It'll be for the Chancellor.
Are you still getting rid of those 20-mile-per-hour speed limits that local authorities
It'll be for the
can
Chancellor to decide in a fortnight's time, what further steps he wants to take.
Right, Stephen, minimum service legislation. At the beginning of the programme, we talked about the fact that ministers have actually set out how it will be used in practice. Do you support it so that there aren't as many or widespread strikes over Christmas?
No, I don't. What I support is government engaging proactively with the trade unions in order to try and meet their demands, their justifiable demands, given the fact that they can't afford to pay their energy bills, their mortgage bills or their food bills. Now in Scotland, what we've seen is not a single strike in our NHS over the course of this entire period, in stark contrast to what's happened here in England, because we've proactively negotiated with the unions. That should be the starting point for government, not trying to force people to do something that they otherwise wouldn't.
Right, but Stephen, if there's a strike, if there's a rail strike called over Christmas by the unions in England and affecting Scotland, there will be trains running in England, but not then in Scotland. Do you think constituents will be happy with that?
I think in relation to our discussions with the rail unions in Scotland, they've been very positive. Obviously there's challenges there in respect of Network Rail, but the Scottish Government has sought to engage proactively. That's the way government should be acting.
All right, Stephen Flynn, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to all of our guests for being here today. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15, because there's no Prime Minister's Questions on BBC Two and the iPlayer. From all of us here, though, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.